So we're recording this afternoon's webinar and sharing it with registrants after, and we'll post it on our website as well. A few housekeeping, as I mentioned, we're recording. We do ask that you stay muted during the presentation just to limit background noise, but when it comes time for the Q&A after the presentation, we're happy to have you come off mute and ask your questions, or if you'd rather, you can feel free to put those in the chat. Oh, I'm sorry, Louise just said I'm not loud enough. Hopefully that's better. And then you should be able to have access to closed captioning at the bottom of your screen, so you can enable that if you're in need. And I think that's it. We are hosting several other events as part of National Public Health Week. So we have one tomorrow at 4 on, it's a public health career panel. So if you're new to public health or you aren't familiar with the field, we encourage you to attend that. And then on Wednesday at 9, we'll be having a webinar on the current state of PFAS in Maine. And on Thursday, if you're a member of MPHA, we're doing a members walk and networking event. So we hope you can come to that, and I'll put all of that information in the chat, as well as if you're not a member, we are running a new member special this week in celebration of National Public Health Week, and hope that you can join us. So I think that's it. I would love to welcome our presenter for this afternoon, Dr. Dan Renko. He's an associate professor of anthropology and coordinator of the Native American Research Center at the University of Maine. His research focuses on the ways in which Indigenous communities in the U.S. have resisted environmental destruction by using their Indigenous diplomacies and critiques of liberalism to protect cultural resources, and how state knowledge systems rooted in colonial contexts continue to expose Indigenous peoples to an inordinate amount of environmental risk. So we're really happy to have you here today, and I will turn it over to you. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Heather, and thanks for everyone showing up. There's some, I see some familiar names and faces that might have even heard this, some of this data I'm going to share with you today. Yeah, this represents work that's ongoing. I'm going to give a little bit more context for it, as well as work, but there are new initiatives at the University of Maine in terms of supporting Wabanaki tribal nations and climate change adaptation, and we're just starting a few of them. I'm happy to talk about them as at the end or during Q&A. So let me share my screen. I do want to point out that some of the data I'll share was collected by my graduate student at the time, Natalie Michelle, who's now a PhD and actually is a postdoc doing more of this work related to climate change adaptation in particular. So just quick overview. I do want to introduce folks to climate justice in the context of this work, especially in the United States. Of course, that work is more broadly global in scope, and Indigenous people are at the sort of forefront in leadership around climate justice work. Our particular set of engagements started with a grant by the Passamaquoddy tribe from the Bureau of Indian Affairs from 2015 to 2017 called Steps in Adapting Wabanaki Culture and Economy to a Changing Climate. I do want to set the scene of sort of Wabanaki diplomacy as a cultural framework for collective decision-making related to issues like the climate crisis. Ask, can climate adaptation work reflect Indigenous community perspectives, and share some of our findings in thinking about adaptation and action in response to the climate crisis, for sure. Let's see here. Yes. So just a little bit of the context around what climate justice is. It's the notion that some groups of people will be more impacted by climate change, and that a just society will build this disproportionate impact into our climate mitigation and adaptation policies. That's sort of the general approach. For Indigenous peoples, the value of Indigenous culture as a part of this adaptation and response is a key part of this discussion, as well as sort of addressing past and ongoing harms because of colonization. I always like to return to the National Climate Assessment for the United States that for the first time in 2018 had Indigenous people as a sort of its own separate category and engagement. And this National Climate Assessment had three key messages around climate impacts on Indigenous people in the United States. The three critical findings are that Indigenous livelihoods and economies are at risk because of climatic change. The physical, mental, and Indigenous values-based health are at risk. So this intersection around physical, mental values, as well as Indigenous values, lead to forms of health risks, is an ongoing part of colonization, wherein Indigenous people are already faced, because of colonization, various forms of physical, mental, and sort of cultural threats, and that this will worsen through climate change. And then the third one is that adaptation, disaster management, displacement, and community-led relocations will be a critical part of the discussion and impacts around Indigenous people, especially in the North, in the Arctic region, but all over. And we see this happening not only in Alaska, but for example, in the southeastern part of the United States. Just a little bit of a map around Indigenous people's placement across the United States. Probably not that surprising, the locations, but I will say sort of North and Eastern Maine are places where there are a little bit more percentage of Indigenous people, and that's where I'm going to center my discussion, of course. One thing that the National Climate Assessment does really well is think about this sort of wheel of vulnerability and sort of how the colonial legacies have played into that, especially as it relates to human health. So basically, when you think about infrastructure, economic, and health considerations, there's this, three pieces that they talk about: health, household and community infrastructure, regional systems of infrastructure, and essential services. And again, sort of how these play out within particular Indigenous communities across the United States are pretty dramatic in the way that things are already a struggle around this infrastructure. For example, just looking at water infrastructure, which the Passamaquoddies are also facing currently, it's an estimated 12% of Indigenous households lack safe water supply or wastewater disposal. And of course, something like that will be, impactful of health and then become worse because of climate change. And then Indigenous communities are often located, as they are here in Maine, in the poorer regions of the country, and the rural poorer regions of the country, which already face infrastructure challenges. And then sort of this the placement of essential services within Indigenous communities these essential services have been starved over time by ongoing US colonialism. So that wheel it creates a real threat to tribal health and well-being with more dramatic climatic change. For our work, we kind of mobilize this idea of adaptive resilience in terms of thinking about adaptation as based in community, social, and cultural resilience, not in the sort of way of how much outside resources can people get, but that community mobilization and having legitimate practices for adaptation within the cultural and social context is an important part of that. There are some classical notions of resilience that this that this hooks onto, I think, pretty well in terms of thinking about both top down and bottom up frames for community control around the knowledge and outputs in terms of inputs, outputs, knowledge, in terms of adaptation. And then, this is building upon a lot of work, especially in Alaska, Kofinas and Chapin reflecting on that even in 2009, that is really identifying community assets as a key to this sort of resilience and ability to adapt. So our work in terms of tribal climate adaptation here in what is now Maine, really looking at starting with this work that I mentioned with the Passamaquoddy tribe, building a climate adaptation baseline for all of the communities starting in 2015. And the goal of that work was to create a community-based, salient, culturally relevant climate adaptation plans for all Wabanaki tribal nations in Maine. And to look at, in particular, the impacts on Wabanaki health, such as increased pathogens, destruction of tribal infrastructure, loss of habitat and subsistence resources caused by changing weather patterns, sea level rise, temperature changes. And this builds upon earlier work engaging with the federal government. FEMA did for the very first time in 2012 emergency response plans with the tribes that included climate hazard mitigation planning and other things. So again, for us, we engage in this community resilient kind of work, thinking about the multi-method approach influenced by community-based participatory research, indigenous research methods, sustainability science, that really hooks on to the idea that adaptation can and should be based in community, social, and cultural resilience. For me, in terms of doing this work, it really is about thinking about Wabanaki diplomacy as both place and process. This will also works to emphasize this notion of community resilience, but it taps into centuries worth of Indigenous people coming together to solve problems that collectively impact us across this landscape of the greater Wabanaki territory. So I'm sure everyone knows this, but this is the location of the tribal nations here in what is now Maine. This is the locations and seat of government. The Aroostook Band of Micmacs is now called the Micmac Nation, but also just where on the landscape we are still presently located. And that because it was a Bureau of Indian Affairs grant, it was very much focused on our communities in the state. But even there, the grant was actually supposed to capture all of tribal lands. So to really start doing assessment across all tribal lands, which you can see in this map on the left, is inclusive of various forms of land across the state of Maine, mostly in central and eastern Maine, but here in western Maine, both Penobscot Nation and Passamaquoddy tribe have lands that are under our collective control and management. And we are very aware of sort of the ongoing impacts on these lands as well. And then more critically, when we mobilize this decision-making framework for a collective problem solving, it is across this greater landscape, the Wabanaki, the greater Wabanaki landscape, or the Dawn land, as we often refer to it, that this is what we are also mobilizing. So our kin and other responsibilities and relations map onto a different kind of landscape than just the state of Maine. And that's really important in terms of the kind of protocols and work that the tribes themselves are engaging in. So I've hinted at this before, the process of engaging in Wabanaki diplomacy as a way to think about issues that impact us all as Wabanaki people and everyone that actually lives in our territory. It stretches back hundreds, if not thousands of years in terms of the protocols and the way of problem solving. It's multinational, it's multicultural. It's for us documented in our wampum belt tradition. It has a series of protocols, and very much the Confederacy itself was formalized during the early stages of colonization by the English and the French. And then also that this is a flexible kind of notion of problem solving. This is all to decenter sort of the nation state elements of this, climate framework, and to think about something else in terms of relationality and responsibility and storytelling. And so these are a couple of scholars talking about this Confederacy as it's an adaptable kind of framework, but also engages in things like persuasive discourse and engaging one another. The protocols that we mobilize are related to the Confederacy itself, and in the Passamaquoddy language, Zidakwen Doli Westu. Everyone talks, or everyone has a seat at the table is on the one hand, a radical form of democracy, but also structured by a particular set of processes and relations across the landscape. One way to think about this, Kyle White, who's a Potawatomi scholar, thinker, philosopher, he has this piece from 2020 called Too Late for Indigenous Climate Justice, Ecological and Relational Tipping Points. But what I think is really similar in a way to kind of explain this use of our Confederacy is to think about this as kinship and climate change coming together. And he points out that our intellectual traditions and our forms of knowing through political activism and relationships of mutual responsibility are what we refer to as kin relationships. So even our Confederacy talks about the interrelationship between the different tribal nations as brothers or as fathers, grandfathers, sisters, often using brother and sister terminology. And this is a relational set of responsibilities that are tied to humans and non-humans. That's why the landscape as the action is really important. It requires cross-societal coordination. It often takes time to develop, and that the practical and philosophical traditions from these stories focus on understanding how the fabric of relational qualities in a society can guarantee the coordination needed to adapt as best as possible to constant change. So change is a critical element of this collective problem solving around kin. And I think that's also to its credit, sort of how we mobilize the Confederacy. So in our work in mobilizing these sort of forms of relations and method, we've obviously, these are probably not that surprising to anyone in terms of the threats across the Wabanaki tribal nations are commonly identified, that, the increase in winter ticks and that's impact on the loss of moose already happening and already being studied, but that more broadly kind of how we think about these other kinds of threats, increase in degree days, increase in invasive species, various forms of erosion from increased precipitation that causes other feedback mechanisms, all point to already some changing strategies around hunting and fishing. And so subsistence lifestyles are already being shifted. I think if you know anyone who hunts and fishes, they've also adapted in the last 20 years to different kinds of conditions on the ground. In terms of Wabanaki land stewardship, this increase in water temperature obviously leading to the impacts on fish and forest practices, increases in air temperature leading to increased invasive species. I already talked about ticks, mosquitoes, some other changing forestry practices. The shifting northern Maine climate transition zone is also seeing some pretty interesting changes around species in terms of plants, insect, bird, tree relations, and sort of that various form of as climate impacts species, their response to those climatic changes don't happen on the same time scale. So there are different kinds of impacts being seen there. And of course, what draws Wabanaki people into this work in terms of cultural values, why it matters, in particular, subsistence and food sovereignty issues are core to this. economic, health, and recreation issues are kind of interrelated as sort of secondary, but definitely the food sovereignty issues have become core in terms of the physical and mental and health issues. Ongoing in terms of the priorities being set by the communities, and this really speaks to the issues around ongoing climate resilience being based in the frameworks of cultural resilience for each community. The fight against native language and story loss, that this is the knowledge base from which we will draw in terms of our adaptation, which taps into various forms of adaptations from centuries and centuries past, is critical adaptation priority, as well as, of course, food sovereignty. I mentioned that, connections to food, issues in terms of relation to even things like sea mammals, which we don't have really much of a access to, but really fighting for that as a next part of our food sovereignty fight. And of course, I mentioned moose and ticks. The protection around healthy food webs reaches in all sorts of directions, anything from protecting soil conditions to the facilitation of diadromous and anadromous fish. So anadromous fish like salmon, alewives, those kinds of things, and then diadromous fish like eels. Really thinking about, and this has been core fights for generations as well, but really fighting to protect and enhance these resources as a part of our food sovereignty. Another one, we share this with some other tribes, is the protection of cultural sites, especially along the coast threatened by sea level rise and erosion. Again, these are the stored locations of our past adaptations, so protecting them will be an important part of that. As well as this mobilization to protect more broadly, and there's work with, I saw, I think one or two of our land trust friends on the call, protecting our cultural resources broadly across the landscape is a critical part of this work. We think of brown ash, cedar, spruce, sweetgrass, maple. All these resources have sort of key cultural keystones for Wabanaki communities and cultures. Ongoing work to protect water quality and quantity, and then again, the healthy soil for healthy foods is an ongoing set of work. I just put in a grant with the Penobscot Nation just to do this, protect healthy soils and build food sovereignty. Ongoing work represents also writing more broadly across the Confederacy and the landscape climate adaptation planning, and engaging in political and cultural work after each community does their own. There's a real possibility that what gets shifted in Wabanaki communities across the US-Canada border can shift the point of action, create multilateral, more significant actions across the landscape, and using various forms of Indigenous protocols and rights formulations to kind of motivate that work. And really focusing on what is common among us. Of course, the food sovereignty seems to be one of those issues. Engaging in various forms of coastal work is something that we're really looking forward to doing in the next couple of years. And then some of the challenges of Indigenous research method and community participatory work, making sure that there is strong sharing of knowledge, strong communication, a shared commitment, use of technology, which we have been able to do. I think we've been all forced to that in the last couple of years, and really working together, although the lack of face-to-face meeting has slowed down this work, especially as it relates to building broader cultural relations with across the border and even within our own communities. Again, working to leverage the Confederacy to help one another in this wider region. This is related to work within the Confederacy itself to listen to clan mothers, families, again, strengthen the identities. Our clans often have particular roles and responsibilities related to particular species, in formulating an interrelated planning and that sort of thing related to climate action and adaptation will be critical in this next, decade or two. And then I mentioned this a little bit, but using things like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to link us and articulate action across the international boundary, I do think that recentering Wabanaki landscape and frameworks can help mobilize different kinds of actors and possibilities across climate adaptation. In terms of ongoing adaptation needs, which are very much in process, education on climate-related topics for tribal leadership and membership, that's a pretty high priority. We see this through the Wabanaki Youth and Science Program, where we get more hands-on projects, more children involvement, but at a host of scales, really thinking about community-based projects around adaptation that kind of create and maintain the salience and legitimacy of this work within communities. And this is true of any community, if you're doing it sort of on a smaller scale, that kind of work. And I think that communication is key to that. Tribal governments, much like other governments, face challenges in terms of integrated community planning related to climatic change. So really thinking across the things like transportation, social services, health, emergency response, wildlife, how do we get them all sort of focusing across various silos within governmental institutions, but also how does that relate to the broader civic culture within the tribal communities and sort of how to mobilize that. Again, we're seeing a lot of work related to food sovereignty, which also has been emphasized through the COVID pandemic, but really sort of thinking about climate, food, and community-based response in really unique and mobilizing ways. So in terms of conclusions, and cut this short a little bit because hopefully you can tell a little bit suffering from a cold here. But the BI grant dissemination, even though the grant ended a few years ago, that sort of legacy of the dissemination and planning is ongoing. We're engaging with any cask and actually starting just a couple of weeks ago here at the University of Maine in the Wabanaki Center, we've become a NECASC sort of partner and sub-grant awardee to really mobilize and coordinate a lot of the tribal community-based work for NECASC. So we're really excited about that. Natalie, who did the data collection for a lot of this, is now a postdoc and doing that role. So I think we're really excited about scaling that work up, not across just Maine and of course NECASC. It won't necessarily go into Canada, but the CASCs have some relations with some Canadian institutions, but also more broadly across the eastern part of the United States. And again, just as a review, kind of thinking about Wabanaki diplomacy as both a place, the landscape of Wabanaki, the broader Wabanaki context, but as a process and collective form of international multicultural decision-making to kind of recenter Indigenous frameworks and responsibilities and kin networks and relations. Obviously, climate adaptation planning can link to Indigenous places and processes. We're in the process of writing a climate change adaptation menu for the Wabanaki tribes, which is conceived as, again, across the greater Wabanaki area into Canada, but really thinking about adaptation using ongoing forms of and historic forms of climate adaptation, mobilizing burning and controlled burning as landscape management, among a whole host of other things, and putting this into a kind of series of strategies for a climate adaptation menu. And then really I think that the decentering and recentering of Wabanaki place and protocol pushes the possibilities of adaptation and resilience to a different kind of context. It is a part of climate and environmental justice. Globally, you see a lot of climate adaptation work happening where Indigenous people are actually, during things like the the reforestation protocol for climate mitigation, Indigenous people would be kicked out of forests to sort of document and make sure that carbon sinks were being protected, and in other areas too, that there's a real sort of possibility that climate change adaptation will be on the backs of Indigenous people. And I think centering Indigenous people's frameworks and decision making will help prevent, those kinds of policies from taking hold as the issues around climate change adaptation get more and more urgent in the coming years. So, I say, you change, not us. Sort of who and why and where must change during adapting to climate change, and who has resources and what kinds of frameworks we mobilize is a really critical part in terms of this notion of climate justice. So I'll stop there and have plenty of time for questions. And again, bear with me, my voice I'm struggling with a little bit. Didn't want to cancel with you guys, of course.
Thank you, we appreciate it. And thank you so much for that presentation. Please, if you have questions, you can feel free to bring yourself off mute, or if you'd rather put them in the chat. One of the things I'm curious about, I think in the general population, we have a difficult time getting people to understand the immediacy of climate change. And I wonder with tribal populations and Indigenous communities, if there is more of that immediacy because of your inherent connections to the land and the way that you use it as opposed to others.
So yeah, and I will share my slides too. I see that in the chat. Yeah, in general, I think, the National Climate Assessment and the work by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, shows that Indigenous people are the front lines of the impacts of the work, partly because of place-based relations. And, this gets interwoven with other forms of, again, ongoing colonial impositions on our lands and peoples. So I think that it's hard to separate some of these things out. But, if we see things like, who hunts moose in Maine, the tribes have a pretty big role, say, in the moose hunt. There's that lottery, of course, that in general people get access to hunting moose, but you already see, it's not so much that Indigenous people are the only ones sort of being impacted in terms of, like I said, anyone who hunts and fish in the last couple of decades are changing their approaches to things, and that's pretty much related to climatic change. But in terms of really, supporting and maintaining infrastructure related to where the tribes are, and that sort of the wheels of vulnerability, right? It is, minor shifts for particular people who have, particular subsistence needs and kind of rely on those sources of protein for diet, that creates more vulnerability, right? In terms of those shifting, figuring out now where to go to hunt or to fit, when can you clam? These are all changing things that most of you all know that's happening across our landscape, but sort of, again, that kind of acuteness of that vulnerability wheel, and then the closeness that the culture has to place, for sure.
Thank you. Other questions from the group? Give it a pause before I keep asking. Louise puts in the chat, I believe we could benefit from understanding at some level how your Confederacy consults together to develop the processes for change and adaptation as much as is appropriate from the Wabanaki perspective.
Yeah, and I think some of this, we're trying to document that a little bit better, and also figure out how much we can share at this point. There is this sort of, this is pretty 10,000 feet level around the work, but I think, we're still, as we work on our climate change adaptation menu, more of the protocols related to the Confederacy will be shared. Again, I just shared that one sort of framework of sort of who talks and how important that is. But I think, there is sort of the protocols of when people kind of engage and communicate, and the various roles of women as it relates to particular resources, and sort of their putting forward representatives, where we've been trying to plan a women's clan mothers type of convening, so we could sort of figure out how much to share, how to share it in terms of the decision-making framework that often starts with women and women's roles and responsibilities across different resources. So it can get there are protocols as they play out, and it's really connected to work that you see more broadly around land back and repatriation, that the stewardship responsibilities rooted in Indigenous peoples and cultures are really a critical part of this work. So yeah, stay tuned, I guess, a little bit, but also, we're really careful around how this knowledge gets shared and sort of mobilized. But it will be, it is the purpose of this work, is to share it across the landscape, and to really mobilize with non-Indigenous people the kind of discussion and frameworks around climate adaptation.
Thank you. And the next question we have is from Chris. I'm just wondering if you can address the issue of data sharing between the tribes and between national state entities.
Yeah. So yeah, data sharing it's been written about quite a bit. There was a report by the that USDA helped fund, and I can link to it. It's from 2014, where they talk about the various ways in which around climate change issues, the data can be protected, even given our current sort of federal and state frameworks. Some of it has to do with developing data management plans, which address the sort of idea of risk. So in that report, it talks about various forms of risk in terms of sharing or oversharing data, and the kinds of sort of mechanisms and training that can really help mitigate or reduce any of the kind of risks related to sharing data. But I think, I think it's a little bit of it is just planning ahead, realizing when Indigenous knowledge systems are mobilized, the notion of private and public can be different in terms of how knowledge works. And I think once you start with that, we see some really good examples that have been developed around data sharing. And I can share that report too. It's in my, Advil Colden signed this state. I'm spacing on the name of the report, but it was a USDA funded report on sort of guidelines and protocols around climate change data and data sharing.
Thank you. Other questions?
Hi, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Yes. Hi, Darren.
Hey,
Thank you. Thanks for your presentation. Sorry about your cold.
That's all right.
Tea waiting for you.
Something. I have as much liquids as I can.
Great. I have a question about, it's sort of coming from my perspective, working with you in the first slide on the conservation community coming together as non-native allies and centering this work. Are there other coalitions or collaborations in different sectors, recognizing colonization did all this dividing and we shouldn't be divided, but here's where we are. So not, you know, being sort of a lurker on the public health emails, the wonderful ones that Heather sends out, I don't know as much, but is there anything that centers health, thinking about that cycle around, like, how do we get the data out about the rural, you know, all those, that intersection?
Yeah, you know, no, not that I'm aware of. I see little blurbs around it. You know, part of it, I think, is speaking to what I kind of mentioned within the context of internal tribal governments, but, you know, the frameworks that motivate even the funding for tribal nation you know, for tribal nations and the governments is coming from, you know, like the Indian Health Service funding stream still functions really separately from the Bureau of Indian Affairs funding stream. And so that they're not, you know, Bureau of Indian Affairs has taken some pretty important leadership because it's in the Interior, Department of Interior, around funding the tribal climate work, and you know, thinking about that from a natural resource health perspective, but we don't see much in terms of IHS, which is, you know, constantly underfunded for essential basic services. Like, we don't see it quite the integration that you would want there in terms of the entities driving tribal governmental response. So I think you're identifying kind of on a more national scale, the kind of thing I was just speaking to in a local context that people are super aware of. So I think, yeah, no, no is the thing. I honestly like the way we're making the connections around food sovereignty. So in the context of USDA and that kind of funding stream, which isn't as big a player in Indian country exactly, although NRCS and some other folks have stepped up in recent years, really getting, you know, that them more engaged in tribal work and through various in various ways. So I think, you know, it's a struggle we all have, right? Which is connecting things like, you know, human health and climate. You know, this isn't, the interfaces are not well thought through at this point. I mean, there's hope and people are trying to think about it a little bit more, but yeah, I think you're identifying kind of still this problem, which we all face.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Here's the report in terms of guidelines for the data issues, again from 2014. You'd think I could, I teach that, so you'd think I'd have more easy.
We can blame the cold medicine. And thanks, Jess, for that question. Other questions from folks? Oh, here we go. Sorry. What policies or practices do we need at the university system level to be ready to follow Indigenous leadership in Maine?
Yeah, you know, that's a great question. And, you know, I always have ideas on these things, but, you know, I really think, you know, our approach, for example, with the Wabanaki Youth in Science program is, you know, that program started as a sort of, you know, STEM education program for Indigenous youth. And we really centered on middle and high school students from 2012 up to 2017. And then we established a framework for it to engage at the university through courses in forestry and engineering, and we've expanded that out, wildlife a little bit. And then really, what does it take to engage Indigenous knowledge systems and frameworks in science education, you know, in terms of especially place-based formulations around science education. I think supporting that work would be really important because it has a kind of, it really benefits Indigenous students. That was the reason why we engaged this protocol and we're building on various frameworks, one of which is Wabanaki in origin called two-eyed seeing. So this idea that Indigenous and Western science together, right, creates a fuller picture of the world and how to kind of be responsible and engage in so supporting the, a slight, it's always hard to change STEM pedagogy. I don't know if anyone's tried to do that. We told NSF when we got a grant in 2017 that we would do it in 2 years. So I'm not sure why they thought that was possible. But anyway, we did run our show and refined it and engaged a series of best practices around science education. So I think that's a really important space in terms of the development, sort of, this pathway of, we even have the WAYS program has even a component of it being run up at Holton Band of Maliseets in Head Start. So even in pre-K, right, in exposing Indigenous children to Indigenous concepts and forms of science and story that kind of motivate Indigenous science at those early ages and kind of building up the leadership there. But I think the other space that is really important and is through grants and faculty hiring, the kinds of things that would really emphasize specialists in Indigenous science. We're right at the end of the process hiring an Indigenous food sovereignty specialist, and they're going to have roles within it with extension, but then also on the natural resources side, I think hiring an Indigenous knowledge specialist related to forestry or wildlife or any of those kinds of areas, I think would also just create the possibilities for intersection and interweaving that we're really committed to in terms of the two-eyed seeing, and then just broadening that in terms of access institutionally, say even beyond the University of Maine. We've developed a program at UMaine Machias, which of course technically is now part of the University of Maine, but really developing Indigenous leadership through the WAYS framework of two-eyed seeing, but engaging in Machias and really emphasizing Passamaquoddy tribes. So sort of also bringing that sort of student development into the university at different, at the other northern campuses in particular, to engage more directly with the tribes. So I think there's a lot that can be done in terms of the pedagogical supports, the research supports, the faculty development, and that's so those practices and policies in terms of we have a great framework for MOU between the University of Maine and the Penobscot Nation that was signed in 2018 that protects Indigenous knowledge to a certain extent, and creates a set of responsibilities by the University of Maine as it relates to Penobscot Nation cultural heritage items. And those responsibilities are kind of unique and driven by, righting past wrong, that sort of thing. So I think leaning into that space around Indigenous knowledge management and data management, I think in these MOUs, I think would be really great statements by the university. And we're actually kind of through the eDNA EPSCoR project, kind of working on some protocols to begin that process, even as we sort of take samples of environmental DNA across the landscape in different territories of Indigenous people, creating a framework of engagement as well. Yeah, Jess, that MOU is on the webpage. I guess it's down a little bit now for Native American programs at the University of Maine. You can download it from there.
Any other questions before we move to wrap up? I'm going to be cognizant of people's colds and time away from screens this afternoon.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm usually funny, more dynamic than this, but it's a little challenging.
That's okay. As I've told some other groups, my darling son gave me the stomach bug, so this is a little selfish too.
I hear you. These are great. These are great questions, by the way. I think I'm happy to share more of our findings, but we're really looking forward to expanding this work. Like literally, the postdoc Natalie is just started 3 days ago or whatever. Like we're really at the precipice with the any cask work and mobilizing this work around food sovereignty, which is so tied to health. There's just, I think, a lot of excitement around this. So
yeah, it's a great topic, and we really appreciate you taking time this afternoon to talk to all of us, and appreciate all of you for coming and attending and learning and listening and asking great questions. As I mentioned at the beginning, we do have a public health career panel tomorrow at 4 and learning about the current state of PFAS at 9 on Wednesday morning. And Thursday, we'll be doing a members walk and networking event at 4:30 in Portland. So we hope you can join us for all of that. We still have the recording happening right now, so we'll get that circulated out to registrants and up on our website. And I'll include the link that Dr. Renko shared in the chat too in the follow-up email. So thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful afternoon. And many, many thanks to you, Professor, for being here. And we appreciate all your great work.
My pleasure. Thanks, Heather. Bye, everyone.